to change that back. Hang on just a moment. Yes, I did. All right. It's all good. So, hello. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may happen to be, my tiny army, my wild darlings. Lovely to see you. Lovely to be here with you. I hope we haven't screwed you up too much with European Daylight Savings Time. If so, you may be watching this after the fact on YouTube or something like that, and that's okay too. I know many of you enjoy the liveness of it, and that's why I do it live. But it's still the same thing when you see it after the fact. It's not timely. This is not the news, although, you know, it's tad news, such as it is. Excuse me. It's been a good week, been an interesting week. We had one of our young people who has been in the Midwest for the best part of a year, came back to visit and brought her roommate with her, which was grand. And we had a really lovely time seeing both of them and meeting the roommate for the first time. And what else have we done? I worked. Got a lot of work in during the week, plugging away at the Splintered Sun. Beginning to feel like, okay, yeah, now I'm kind of getting the feel of it. I know how it goes now. I'm about 130 pages in or so, maybe a bit more. And, you know, it's kind of taken on the form that I wanted. I'm still solving a few problems. I've had to have more focal point characters than I had expected. But that's just, you know, that's the way I like to tell stories. And I don't like too much using the overall narrative voice of explaining everything. I would rather have witnesses, so to speak, you know, to what's happening, what I call focal point characters. If I was like a really classy, super like important writer, I would call them FPCs or something, and everybody would go like, oh yeah, FPCs. Yeah, Williams talks about that. Yeah, you got to use FPCs. But as I suggested in my usage of the term "tiny army" today, when I was announcing that I would be reading this weekend, I do not, despite the occasional surfacing of articles like, why don't more people talk about this guy's books or whatever, I'm somewhat resigned to the fact that I have a small but very intelligent and devoted coterie of readers. And I would rather have however many I've got. Certainly, it's still a lot. I mean, I'm very lucky. I make a living doing this, and that means I'm selling lots of books somewhere. Even if I'm not being discussed all that often on the internet, the intertubes. But so I've got no complaints about that really. But it is kind of funny sometimes when I think about how people that I know, people that I hang out with or have hung out with, and oftentimes people I have a lot of respect for, are just in a different ballpark. But that's a minor thing. And what I was talking about was the Splintered Sun. So how did I get onto that? Oh, because I was talking about style things and the use of focal point characters. Again, my term. And I don't expect it will ever spread, because it is very much something, though, that I find extremely useful when writing, is to not because, and I've said this before, but I mean, part of it when I started writing fantasy fiction, I was comparing myself to two general waves of fantasy fiction. And the first was Tolkien and those who came before him or who were roughly contemporary. People like E.R. Edison and Lord Dunsany and Clark Ashton Smith and, the whole kind of gang of Lovecraft. I mean, everybody who was writing fantastic fiction before the Lord of the Rings changed the playing field, really changed things and made epic fantasy a whole subset that largely came to dominate fantasy as a field. Not so much in terms of winning awards and things like that, but certainly in terms of the sheer volume of material. And then George had all of his success with a big epic fantasy, and that has kind of cemented this idea that when you say fantasy, people assume you're talking about dragons, castles, etc., pre-industrial, whatever. And any other kind of fantasy outside of an academic or an in-house fantasy only discussion, any other kind of fantasy usually has a name tacked onto the front of it, like urban fantasy or dark fantasy or whatever. Um, but anyway, so there are two basic waves of writers that I was studying and had grown up on the first kind, the Tolkien and pre-Tolkien. William Morris, this whole group of different kinds of people, Fletcher Pratt. And then all the people who were coming out with fantasy fiction, again, largely epic fantasy in the wake of Tolkien, like Thomas Covenant and Ray Feist and Terry Brooks and various other folk. I'm sure I'm missing people here. Jim Rigney, of course, the actual name of the guy who wrote The Wheel of Time, and various other people. I'm just going blank on the name. But anyway, so one of the things that I noticed is that I felt like telling the story from the point of view of every single character, or at least many different characters, to represent the complexity of the world in question, made for me what felt like a more modern form of epic fantasy, which is kind of silly in a sense because, of course, epic fantasy is a direct springs directly from both the sort of myth and folklore of the classical era, things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also from medieval romances and folk tales. So it seems funny to talk about trying to make something more contemporary when it's so firmly based in old-fashioned storytelling, some of it literally thousands of years old. Um, some of it based on what are perhaps the first stories ever told. But to me, obviously, things have to grow and things have to change. And I didn't feel like I could write something that I would enjoy writing unless I could bring something to it that worked for me and felt different than some of the things that I had read, which many of, as I said, of the contemporary stuff that was coming out after Tolkien was very much felt as if it was, a continuation of Tolkien. In some cases, an imitation of Tolkien. And one of the things it was imitating oftentimes was that idea of, a narrator kind of explaining everything to you as you go. Oh, I thought of somebody else, Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, Guy Kay was somebody who also, from the books of his that I've read, has explored more telling the stories from the point of view of individual characters and letting the audience make up their own minds about that. And if you haven't read, for instance, Kay's, if you like epic fantasy, and you haven't read Guy Gavriel Kay's The Fiona Var Tapestry, of which the first book is The Summer Tree, if I remember correctly. I mean, I read this 40 years ago, so it's hard for me to say, 30 years ago, whatever. But that's well worth it. And Kay is a very fine writer and also a good person. He's a nice guy, too. He is Canadian, but, we can all make allowances for accidents of birth. But anyway, no. Guy Kay, great writer, good guy. And one of the world's leading Tolkienists, I think you could say. And he actually, I believe, participated in some of Christopher Tolkien's publications of his father's J.R.R. Tolkien's work. It's always tempting to say John J. Railroad Tolkien, like George Railroad Martin, but that's another story. All of us who grew up playing Monopoly can't help but see RR and think railroad. Okay, so here I'm babbling, and I haven't said anything of any use whatsoever yet, but what I will do then, instead of continuing to babble, is I will quickly check in and see if we've got some folks online with us and who have checked in and want to say something. And as usual, I cannot access my comment. What is this? Why do they keep doing this to me? I don't understand. Anyway, okay, so the only comments I see Suzanne has checked in. Um, oh, okay, and Suzanne's recommending one of Guy Kay's lectures on Tolkien. So, yes, check that out. Lions of Al Rasan, Mark suggests. And Andre checks in to say hello. And did I say Thomas Covenant? I thought I said Thomas Covenant like the books. Yes, you're absolutely right. The author was Stephen Donaldson. If I said that, then, just smack me in the head. It's just one of those little brain bubbles. Jay Sheckley chimes in. You're a terrible liar, Jay, but you're a very, very fine human being. Anyway, okay. So I still don't know why all my comments have gone away. Okay, so Jay's checked in, Melissa, Todd Nelson, Rosalba, Shona, Maureen, Bobby Jane. That's a new name, I think. And Penny. So anyway, lovely to see you all. I wish I could actually see the rest of you and any comments you might be making, but as usual, Facebook is messing with my brain and telling me I don't deserve comments. I've only been doing this practically every weekend for 5 years, but apparently I don't deserve to be able to read my own comments. All right, that little bit of bitterness, that little bit of vile bile and venom dripped out. But now I will be more cheerful again. So anyway, it is a pleasure to be back with you. It is lovely to get to hang out with you all, albeit virtually. I hope, as I said, that the difference between European and American daylight savings hasn't messed anybody up too much. Ours, I don't think, is until next weekend, I believe, if I'm correct. Or very soon thereafter. But so I will mention it when I put the stuff on the Facebook stuff, and when I announce the next one, if it's daylight savings. If it's not daylight savings, I'll just put the regular stuff up. Okay, so with no further ado or adieu, I will continue to the reading. And we are, in fact, reading from T.H. White's The Once and Future King, one of my very favorite books and a big influence on the Dragonbone chair in particular, as I have mentioned many times, but it's so obvious I don't think anybody really needed me to mention it. We're only reading, as far as I know, I'm only going to read the first section of The Once and Future King, because it's actually made up of 4 separate books, all relatively short. In fact, the entirety of The Once and Future King is still considerably shorter than almost any one volume of any of my books. But it's well worth the read, and I'm glad you've joined me for it. So, where we were last, Ward had another experience of being in animal form. Merlin had made him into a type of falcon, coincidentally called a merlin. And Ward had spent a rainy night in the mews with the other falcons, had been tested as to whether he was worthy to join them, and had to stand through a very frightening ordeal with Cully, the goshawk, who was crazy, loco en la cabeza. And coming out of it, he had said to Merlin, Kay is very unhappy because he never gets to do anything. And couldn't you turn Kay into something? And Merlin basically says, no, I don't. That's not a power I was given. I was sent to do what I'm doing, and Kay is not part of that. And Wart says something to the effect of, well, can't you give Kay an adventure without turning him into something? And Merlin suddenly says, actually, yes, and you'll have to go right now and go out into the woods with Kay. So Kay and Arthur, the Wart, have gone out into the woods, and as they get deeper and deeper into the woods, first they run across a strange small man who is lying under a tree, and then he doesn't say anything to them, but when they get to the next big tree in this very long clearing they're following, there is a huge man there, and it turns out that his name is John Little, called Little John. And that's where I'm going to go back about a page or so, or half a page and start. Oh, one last thing. Since I know there are British people listening to this, I deeply apologize. I used to be able to at least kind of do a few fake versions of, like a northern accent and stuff. And I've noticed that somewhere along the line, almost every accent that I do, except for occasionally veering into a semi-Cockney or, kind of a BBC received or whatever, or a very artificial sounding upper class toff voice, that all my dialects have turned into Somerset. And that has definitely been the case with Little John, and will be the case with probably various others in this section. I apologize. I don't claim, I haven't acted in anything for years and years, and I apologize for mangling all British dialects into Somerset, as it were. But what can I say? I'm doing the best I can. So anyway, so the boys are coming toward, have stopped to talk to this giant man, Little John, and that's where I'm going to start. The giant gave him a sly peep out of the corner of his eye at this, for he knew that he had set the boys two problems at once. First, what was Robin's real name? And second, how did Little John come to know the warts? The wart fixed on the second question first. How did you know my name? Ah, said Little John, us knowed. Does Robin Hood know we are coming? Nay, my duck, a young scholard like thee should speak his name scholarly. Well, what is his name? Cried the boy, between exasperation and being out of breath from running to keep up. You said Hood. So it is Hood, my duck. Robin Hood, like the hoods you've been running through. And a grand fine name it is. Robin Wood? Aye, Robin Hood. What else should un be, seeing as he rules 'em? Them free places, the hoods and fine places. Let thee sleep in 'em, come summer, come winter, and hunt in 'em for thy commons, lest thee starve, and smell to 'em as they brings forward their comely bright leaves, according to order, or loses of 'em by the same order, backwards. Let thee stand in 'em, that thou be'st not seen, and move in 'em, that thou be'st not heard, and warm thee with 'em, as thou fall'st on sleep. Aye, them proper fine places, the hoods, for a free man of hands and heart. Kay said, but I thought all Robin Hood's men wore hose and jerkins of Lincoln green. That us do in the winter, like, when us needs 'em, or with leather leggins at Hoodurk. But here by summer 'tis more seasonable thus, for the pickets, who have naught to do save watch. Were you a sentry then? Aye, and so were Wald Much, as you spoke to by the felled tree. And I think, exclaimed Kay triumphantly, that this next big tree which we are coming to will be the stronghold of Robin Hood. They were coming to the monarch of the forest. It was a lime tree. For those who are not as familiar with the English usage of lime tree, it's what we would call a linden tree, or the German people would call a linden tree. It was a lime tree, as great as that which used to grow at Moor Park in Herefordshire, no less than 100 feet in height and 17 feet in girth, a yard above the ground. Its beech-like trunk was embellished with a beard of twigs at the bottom, and where each of the great branches had sprung from the trunk, the bark had split and was now discolored with rainwater or sap. The bees zoomed among its bright and sticky leaves, higher and higher toward heaven, and a rope ladder disappeared among the foliage. Nobody could have climbed it without a ladder, even with irons. You think well, Master Kay, said Little John, and there be Maester Robin, a toiner roots. The boys, who had been more interested in the lookout man perched in a crow's nest at the top of that swaying and whispering pride of the earth, lowered their eyes at once and clapped them on the great outlaw. He was not, as they expected, a romantic man, or not at first, although he was nearly as tall as Little John. These two, of course, were the only people in the world who have ever shot an arrow the distance of a mile with the English longbow. He was a sinewy fellow, whose body did not carry fat. He was not half naked, like John, but dressed discreetly in faded green, with a silvery bugle at his side. He was clean-shaven, sunburned, nervous, gnarled like the roots of the trees, but gnarled and mature with weather and poetry rather than with age, for he was scarcely 30 years old. Eventually he lived to be 87 and attributed his long life to smelling the turpentine in the pines. At the moment he was lying on his back and looking upward, but not into the sky. Robin Wood lay happily with his head in Marian's lap. She sat between the roots of the lime tree, clad in a one-piece smock of green, girded with a quiver of arrows, and her feet and arms were bare. She had let down the brown, shining waterfall of her hair, which was usually kept braided in pigtails for convenience in hunting and cookery, and with the falling waves of this she framed his head. She was singing a duet with him softly, and tickling the end of his nose with the fine hairs. "Under the greenwood tree," sang Maid Marian, "who loves to lie with me, and tune his merry note unto the sweet bird's throat?" "Come hither, come hither, come hither," hummed Robin. "Here shall he see no enemy, but winter and rough weather." They laughed happily and began again, singing lines alternately. "Who doth ambition shun, and loves to lie in the sun, seeking the food he eats, and pleased with what he gets." Then, both together, "Come hither, come hither, come hither. Here shall he see no enemy, but winter and rough weather." The song ended in laughter. Robin, who had been twisting his brown fingers in the silk-fine threads which fell about his face, gave them a shrewd tug and scrambled to his feet. "Now, John," he said, seeing them at once. "Now, Maester," said Little John. "So you have brought the young squires?" "They brought me." "Welcome either way," said Robin. "I never heard ill spoken of Sir Ector, nor reason why his sounders should be pursued. How are you, Kay and Wart, and who put you into the forest at my glades on this day of all days?" "Robin," interrupted the lady, "you can't take them." "Why not, sweetheart?" "They are children." "Exactly what we want." "It is inhuman," she said in a vexed way, and began to do her hair. The outlaw evidently thought it would be safer not to argue. He turned to the boys and asked them a question instead. "Can you shoot?" "Trust me," said the wart. "I can try," said Kay, more reserved, as they laughed at the wart's assurance. "Come, Marian, let them have one of your bows." She handed him a bow and half a dozen arrows, 28 inches long. "Shoot the popinjay," said Robin, giving them to Wart. He looked and saw a popinjay 50 paces away. He guessed that he had been a fool, and said cheerfully, "I am sorry, Robin Wood, but I am afraid it is much too far for me." "Never mind," said the outlaw. "Have a shot at it. I can tell by the way you shoot." The wart fitted his arrow as quickly and neatly as he was able, set his feet wide in the same line that he wished his arrow to go, squared his shoulders, drew the bow to his chin, sighted on the mark, raised his point through an angle of about 20 degrees, aimed 2 yards to the right, because he always pulled to the left in his loose, and sped his arrow. It missed, but not so badly. "Now, Kay," said Robin. Kay went through the same motions and also made a good shot. Each of them had held the bow the right way up, had quickly found the cock feather and set it outward. Each had taken hold of the string to draw the bow. Most boys who have not been taught are inclined to catch hold of the nock of the arrow when they draw, between their fingers and thumb. But a proper archer pulls back the string with his first 2 or 3 fingers and lets the arrow follow it. Neither of them had allowed the point to fall away to the left as they drew, nor struck their left forearms with the bowstring. 2 common faults with people who do not know. And each had loosed evenly without a pluck. "Good," said the outlaw. "No lute players here." "Robin," said Marian sharply, "you can't take children into danger. Send them home to their father." "That I won't," he said, "unless they wish to go. It is their quarrel as much as mine." "What is the quarrel?" asked Kay. The outlaw threw down his bow and sat cross-legged on the ground, drawing Maid Marian to sit beside him. His face was puzzled. "It is Morgan Le Fay," he said. "It is difficult to explain her." "I should not try." Robin turned on his mistress angrily. "Marian," he said, "either we must have their help, or else we have to leave the other 3 without help. I don't want to ask the boys to go there, but it is either that or leaving Tuck to her." The wart thought it was time to ask a tactful question, so he made a polite cough and said, "Please, who is Morgan the Fay?" All 3 answered at once. "She'm a bad un," said Little John. "She is a fairy," said Robin. "No, she is not," said Marian. "She is an enchantress." "The fact of the matter is," said Robin, "that nobody knows exactly what she is. In my opinion, she is a fairy. And that opinion," he added, staring at his wife, "I still hold." Kay asked, "Do you mean she's one of those people with bluebells for hats who spend the time sitting on toadstools?" There was a shout of laughter. "Certainly not. There are no such creatures. The Queen is a real one, and one of the worst of them." "If the boys have got to be in it," said Marian, "you had better explain from the beginning." The outlaw took a deep breath, uncrossed his legs, and the puzzled look came back to his face. "Well," he said, "suppose that Morgan is the queen of the fairies, or at any rate has to do with them, and that fairies are not the kind of creatures your nurse has told you about. Some people say they are the oldest of all, who lived in England before the Romans came here, before us Saxons, before the old ones themselves, and that they have been driven underground. Some say they look like humans, like dwarfs, and others that they look ordinary, and others that they don't look like anything at all, but put on various shapes as the fancy takes them. Whatever they look like, they have the knowledge of the ancient Gaels. They know things down there in their burrows which the human race has forgotten about, and quite a lot of these things are not good to hear." "Whisper," said the Golden Lady with a strange look, and the boys noticed that the little circle had drawn closer together. "Well now," said Robin, lowering his voice, "the thing about these creatures that I am speaking of, and if you will excuse me, I won't name them again, is that they have no hearts. It is not so much that they wish to do evil, but that if you were to catch one and cut it open, you would find no heart inside. They are cold-blooded like fishes. They are everywhere, even while people are talking." The boys looked about them. "Be quiet," Robin said. "I need not tell you any more. It is unlucky to talk about them. The point is that I believe this Morgan is the queen of the good folk, and I know she sometimes lives in a castle to the north of our forest called the Castle Chariot. Marian says that the queen is not a fairy herself, but only a necromancer who is friendly with them. Other people say that she is a daughter of the Earl of Cornwall. Never mind about that. The thing is that this morning, by her enchantments, the oldest people of all have taken prisoner one of my servants and one of yours. "Not tack!" cried Little John, who knew nothing of recent developments because he had been on sentry. Robin nodded. "The news came from the northern trees before your message arrived about the boys." "Alas, poor friar!" "Tell it how it happened," said Marian, "but perhaps you had better explain about the names." "One of the few things we know," said Robin, "about the blessed ones is that they go by the names of animals. For instance, they may be called cow or goat or pig, and so forth. So, if you happen to be calling one of your own cows, you must always point to it when you call. Otherwise, you may summon a fairy, a little person, I ought to have said, who goes by the same name, and once you have summoned it, it comes, and it can take you away." "What seems to have happened," said Marian, taking up the story, "is that your dog boy from the castle took his hounds to the edge of the forest when they were going to Scomber, and he happened to catch sight of Friar Tuck, who was chatting with an old man called Wat that lives hereabouts." "Excuse us," cried the two boys. "Is that the old man who lived in our village before he lost his wits? He bit off the dog boy's nose, as a matter of fact, and now he lives in the forest, a sort of ogre?" "It is the same person," replied Robin, "but, poor thing, he is not much of an ogre. He lives on grass and roots and acorns, and would not hurt a fly. I'm afraid you have got your story muddled." "Fancy what, living on acorns?" "What happened," said Marian patiently, "was this. The three of them came together to pass the time of day, and one of the hounds, I think it was the one called Caval, began jumping up at poor Wat to lick his face. This frightened the old man, and your dog boy called out, 'Come here, dog,' to make him stop. He did not point with his finger. You see, he ought to have pointed." What happened?" "Well, my man Scathelock, or Scarlet, as they call him in the ballads, happened to be wood-cutting a little way off, and he says they just vanished, including the dog." "My poor Caval!" "So the fairies have got them." "You mean the people of peace?" I am sorry. But the point is, if Morgan is really the queen of these creatures, and if we want to get them away before they are enchanted, one of their ancient queens, called Circe, used to turn the ones she captured into hogs. We shall have to look for them in her castle." "Then we must go there." Chapter 11. Robin smiled at the elder boy and patted him on the back, while the wart thought despairingly about his dog. Then the outlaw cleared his throat and began to speak again. "You are right about going there," he said, "but I ought to tell you the unpleasant part. Nobody can get into the castle chariot except a boy or girl." "Do you mean you can't get in?" "You could get in." "I suppose," explained the wart when he had thought this over, "it is like the thing about unicorns." "Right. A unicorn is a magic animal, and only a maiden can catch it. Fairies are magic too, and only innocent people can enter their castles. That is why they take away people's children out of cradles." Kay and Wart sat in silence for a moment. Then Kay said, "Well, I am game. It is my adventure, after all." The wart said, "I want to go too. I am fond of Caval." Robin looked at Marian. "Very well," he said. "We won't make a fuss about it, but we will talk about plans. I think it is good of you two to go without really knowing what you are in for, but it will not be so bad as you think." "We shall come with you," said Marian. "Our band will come with you to the castle. You will only have to do the going-in part at the end." "Yes, and the band will probably be attacked by that griffin of hers afterwards." "Is there a griffin?" "Indeed there is. The castle chariot is guarded by a fierce one, like a watchdog. We shall have to get past it on the way there, or it will give the alarm and you won't be able to get in. It will be a terrific stalk. We shall have to wait till night." The boys passed the morning pleasantly, getting accustomed to two of Maid Marian's bows. Robin had insisted on this. He said that no man could shoot with another's bow any more than he could cut with another's scythe. For their midday meal they had cold venison patty with mead, as did everybody else. The outlaws drifted in for the meal like a conjuring trick. At one moment there would be nobody at the edge of the clearing, at the next half a dozen right inside it, green or sunburned men who had silently appeared out of the bracken or the trees. In the end there were about 100 of them, eating merrily and laughing. They were not outlaws because they were murderers or any reason like that. They were Saxons who had revolted against Uther Pendragon's conquest and who refused to accept a foreign king. The fens and wild woods of England were alive with them. They were like soldiers of the resistance in later occupations. Their food was dished out from a leafy bower where Marian and her attendants cooked. The partisans usually posted a sentry to take the tree messages and slept during the afternoon, partly because so much of their hunting had to be done in the times when most workmen sleep, and partly because the wild beasts take a nap in the afternoon, and so should their hunters. This afternoon, however, Robin called the boys to a council. "Look," he said, "you had better know what we are going to do. My band of 100 will march with you toward Queen Morgan's castle in 4 parties. You two will be in Marian's party. When we get to an oak which was struck by lightning in the year of the great storm, we shall be within a mile of the Griffin Guard. We shall meet at a rendezvous there, and afterward we shall have to move like shadows. We must get past the Griffin without an alarm. If we do get past it, and if all goes well, we shall halt at the castle, at a distance of about 400 yards. We can't come nearer because of the iron in our arrowheads, and from that moment you will have to go alone. Now, Kay and Wart, I must explain about iron. If our friends have really been captured by the good people, and if Queen Morgan the Fay is really the queen of them, we have one advantage on our side. None of the good people can bear the closeness of iron. The reason is that the oldest ones of all began in the days of flint, before iron was ever invented, and all their troubles have come from the new metal. The people who conquered them had steel swords, which is even better than iron, and that is how they succeeded in driving the old ones underground. This is the reason why we must keep away tonight, for fear of giving them the uncomfortable feeling. But you two, with an iron knife blade hidden close in your hands, will be safe from the queen so long as you do not let go of it. A couple of small knives will not give them the feeling without being shown. All you will have to do is to walk the last distance, keeping a good grip of your iron. Enter the castle in safety and make your way to the cell where the prisoners are. As soon as the prisoners are protected by your metal, they will be able to walk out with you. Do you understand this, Kay and Wart?" "Yes, please," they said. "We understand this perfectly. There is one more thing. The most important is to hold your iron, but the next most important is not to eat. Anybody who eats in you-know-what stronghold has to stay there forever. So for all sake's sake, don't eat anything whatever inside the castle, however tempting it may look. Will you remember?" "We will." After the staff lecture, Robin went to give his orders to the men. He made them a long speech explaining about the griffin and the stalk and what the boys were going to do. When he had finished his speech, which was listened to in perfect silence, an odd thing happened. He began at the beginning and spoke it from start to finish in the same words. On finishing it for the second time, he said, "Now, captains," and the 100 men split into groups of 20, which went to different parts of the clearing and stood round Marion, Little John, Much, Scarlet, and Robin. From each of these groups, a humming noise rose to the sky. "What on earth are they doing?" "Listen," said the wart. They were repeating the speech, word for word. Probably none of them could read or write, but they had learned to listen and remember. This was the way in which Robin kept touch with his night raiders, by knowing that each man knew by heart all that the leader himself knew, and why he was able to trust them, when necessary, each man to move by himself. When the men had repeated their instructions and everyone was word perfect in the speech, there was an issue of war arrows, 12 to each. These arrows had bigger heads, ground to razor sharpness, and they were heavily feathered in a square cut. There was a bow inspection, and 2 or 3 men were issued with new strings. Then all fell silent. "Now then," cried Robin cheerfully. He waved his arm, and the men, smiling, raised their bows in salute. There was a sigh, a rustle, a snap of one incautious twig, and the clearing of the giant lime tree was as empty as it had been before the days of man. "Come with me," said Marion, touching the boys on the shoulder. Behind them, the bees hummed in the leaves. It was a long march. The artificial glades which led to the lime tree in the form of a cross were no longer of use after the first half hour. After that, they had to make their way through the virgin forest as best they might. It would not have been so bad if they had been able to kick and slash their way, but they were supposed to move in silence. Marion showed them how to go sideways, one side after the other, how to stop at once when a bramble caught them and take it patiently out, how to put their feet down sensitively and roll their weight to that leg as soon as they were certain that no twig was under the foot, how to distinguish at a glance the places which gave most hope of an easy passage, and how a kind of rhythm in their movements would help them in spite of obstacles. Although there were 100 invisible men on every side of them, moving toward the same goal, they heard no sounds but their own. The boys had felt disgruntled at first at being put in a woman's band. They would have preferred to have gone with Robin, and thought that being put under Marion was like being trusted to a governess. They soon found their mistake. She had objected to their coming, but now that their coming was ordered, she accepted them as companions. It was not easy to be a companion of hers. In the first place, it was impossible to keep up with her unless she waited for them, for she could move on all fours or even wriggle like a snake almost as quickly as they could walk. And in the second place, she was an accomplished soldier, which they were not. She was a true wave, except for her long hair, which most of the female outlaws of those days used to clip. One of the bits of advice which she gave them before talking had to be stopped was this: aim high when you shoot in battle, rather than low. A low arrow strikes the ground. A high one may kill in the second rank. "If I am made to get married," thought the wart, who had doubts on the subject, "I will marry a girl like this, a kind of golden vixen." As a matter of fact, though the boys did not know it, Marion could hoot like an owl by blowing into her fists, or whistle a shrill blast between tongue and teeth with the fingers in the corner of her mouth, could bring all the birds to her by imitating their calls, and understand much of their small language, such as when tits exclaim that a hawk is coming, could hit the popinjay twice for 3 times of Robin's, and could turn cartwheels. But none of these accomplishments was necessary at the moment. The twilight fell mistily. It was the first of the autumn mists, and in the dimity the undispersed families of the tawny owl called to each other, the young with "kiwick" and the old with the proper "hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo." The noise called "to-wit, to-woo," which is wished by poets on the owl, is really a family noise made by separate birds. Proportionally, as the brambles and obstacles became harder to see, so did they become easier to feel. It was odd, but in the deepening silence, the wart found himself able to move more silently instead of less. Being reduced to touch and sound, he found himself in better sympathy with these and could go quietly and quick. It was about Compline, or as we should call it, at 9 o'clock at night, and they had covered at least 7 miles of the toilsome forest when Marion touched Kay on the shoulder and pointed into blue darkness. They could see in the dark now as well as human beings can see in it, and much better than townspeople will ever manage to. And there, in front of them, struck through 7 miles of trackless forest by Marion's woodcraft, was the smitten oak. They decided with one accord, without even a whisper, to creep up to it so silently that even the members of their own army, who might already be waiting there, would not know of their arrival. But a motionless man has the advantage of a man in motion, and they had hardly reached the outskirts of the roots when friendly hands took hold of them, patted their backs with pats as light as thistledown, and guided them to seats. The roots were crowded. It was like being a member of a band of starlings or of roosting rooks. In the night mystery, 100 men breathed on every side of Wart, like the surge of our own blood, which we can hear when we are writing or reading in the late and lonely hours. They were in the dark and stilly womb of night. Presently the wart noticed that the grasshoppers were creaking their shrill note, so tiny as to be almost extra audible, like the creak of the bat. They creaked one after another. They creaked when Marion had creaked 3 times to account for Kay and Wart, as well as for herself, 100 times. All the outlaws were present, and it was time to go. There was a rustle, as if the wind had moved in the last few leaves of the 900-year-old oak. Then an owl hooted softly. A field mouse screamed. A rabbit thumped. A dog fox barked in his deep single lion's cough, and a bat twittered above their heads. The leaves rustled again more lengthily while you could count 100, and then Maid Marian, who had done the rabbit's thump, was surrounded by her band of 20 plus 2. The wart felt a man on either side of him take his hand as they stood in a circle, and then he noticed that the stridulation of the grasshoppers had begun again. It was going round in a circle towards him, and as the last grasshopper rubbed its legs together, the man on his right squeezed his hand. Wart stridulated. Instantly the man on his left did the same and pressed his hand also. There were 22 grasshoppers before Maid Marian's band was ready for its last stalk through the silence. The last stalk might have been a nightmare, but to the wart it was heavenly. Suddenly he found himself filled with the exaltation of night, and felt that he was bodiless, silent, transported. He felt that he could have walked up on a feeding rabbit and caught her up by the ears, furry and kicking, before she knew of his presence. He felt that he could have run between the legs of the men on either side of him, or taken their bright daggers from their sheaths while they still moved on, undreaming. The passion of nocturnal secrecy was a wine in his blood. He really was small and young enough to move as secretly as the warriors. Their age and weight made them lumber in spite of all their woodcraft, and his youth and lightness made him mobile in spite of his lack of it. It was an easy stalk, except for its danger. The bushes thinned, and the sounding bracken grew rarely in the swampy earth, so that they could move 3 times as fast. They went in a dream, unguided by owl's hoot or bat's squeak, but only kept together by the necessary pace which the sleeping forest imposed upon them. Some of them were fearful, some revengeful for their comrade, some, as it were, disembodied in the sleep-walk of their stealth. They had hardly crept for 20 minutes when Maid Marian paused in her tracks. She pointed to the left. Neither of the boys had read the books of Sir John de Mandeville, so they did not know that a griffin was 8 times larger than a lion. Now, looking to the left in the silent gloom of night, they saw, cut out against the sky and against the stars, something which they never would have believed possible. It was a young male griffin in its first plumage. The front end and down to the forelegs and shoulders was like a huge falcon. The Persian beak, the long wings in which the first primary was the longest, and the mighty talons, all were the same, but, as Mandeville observed, the whole 8 times bigger than a lion. Behind the shoulders, a change began to take place. Where an ordinary falcon or eagle would content itself with the 12 feathers of its tail, Falco leonis serpentis began to grow the leonine body and the hind legs of the beast of Africa, and after that a snake's tail. The boys saw 24 feet high in the mysterious night light of the moon, and with its sleeping head bowed upon its breast so that the wicked beak lay on the breast feathers, an authentic griffin that was better worth seeing than 100 condors. They drew their breath through their teeth, and for the moment hurried secretly on, storing the majestic vision of terror in the chambers of remembrance. They were close to the castle at last, and it was time for the outlaws to halt. Their captain touched hands silently with Kay and Wart, and the two went forward through the thinning forest towards a faint glow which gleamed behind the trees. They found themselves in a wide clearing or plain. They stood stock still with surprise at what they saw. It was a castle made entirely out of food, except that on the highest tower of all a carrion crow was sitting with an arrow in its beak. The oldest ones of all were gluttons. Probably it was because they seldom had enough to eat. You can even read nowadays a poem written by one of them, which is known as the Vision of Mac Conglini. In this vision there is a description of a castle made out of different kinds of food. The English for part of the poem goes like this. A lake of new milk I beheld in the midst of a fair plain. I saw a well-appointed house thatched with butter, its 2 soft door-posts of custard, its dais of curds and butter, beds of glorious lard, many shields of thin-pressed cheese. Under the straps of those shields were men of soft, sweet, smooth cheese, men who knew not to wound a gale. Spears of old butter had each of them. A huge cauldron full of meat, methought I'd try to tackle it, boiled leafy kale, browny white, a brimming vessel full of milk, a bacon bowes of 2 ribs, a watling of tripe, support of clans, of every food pleasant to man, meseemed the whole was gathered there. Of chitterlings of pigs were made its beautiful rafters, splendid the beams and pillars of marvelous pork. The boys stood there in wonder and nausea before just such a stronghold. It rose from its lake of milk in a mystic light of its own, in a greasy, buttery glow. It was the fairy aspect of Castle Chariot, which the oldest ones, sensing the hidden knife blades after all, had thought would be tempting to the children. It was to tempt them to eat. The place smelt like a grocer's, a butcher's, a dairy, and a fishmonger's rolled into one. It was horrible beyond belief, sweet, sickly, and pungent, so that they did not feel the least wish to swallow a particle of it. The real temptation was to run away. However, there were prisoners to rescue. They plodded over the filthy drawbridge, a butter one, with cow hairs still in it, sinking to their ankles. They shuddered at the tripe and the chitterlings. They pointed their iron knives at the soldiers made of soft, sweet, smooth cheese, and the latter shrank away. In the end, they came to the inner chamber, where Morgan Le Fay herself lay stretched upon her bed of glorious lard. She was a dowdy, middle-aged woman, with black hair and a slight moustache, but she was made of human flesh. When she saw the knives, she kept her eyes shut, as if she were in a trance. Perhaps when she was outside this very strange castle, or when she was not doing that kind of magic to tempt the appetite, she was able to assume more beautiful forms. The prisoners were tied to pillars of marvelous pork. I am sorry if this iron is hurting you," said Kay, "but we have come to rescue our friends." Queen Morgan shuddered. "Will you tell your cheesy men to undo them?" She would not. It is magic," said the ward. "Do you think we ought to go up and kiss her or something frightful like that? Perhaps if we went and touched her with the iron." "You do it." "No, you." "We'll go together." So they joined hands to approach the queen. She began to writhe in her lard like a slug. She was in agony from the metal. At last, and just before they reached her, there was a sloshing rumble or mumble, and the whole fairy appearance of Castle Chariot melted together in collapse, leaving the 5 humans and 1 dog standing together in the forest clearing, which still smelt faintly of dirty milk. "Gor blimey," said Friar Tuck. "Gor blimey and coo. Dash my vig if I didn't think we was done for." "Master," said Dog Boy. Keval contented himself with barking wildly, biting their toes, lying on his back, trying to wag his tail in that position, and generally behaving like an idiot. Old Wat touched his forelock. "Now then," said Kay, "this is my adventure, and we must get home quick." There's still more to go, but I think I'm going to have to stop it there because it's the beginning of another chapter, and I would like to save the griffin for later. So instead, I will mark this and begin the process. Okay, so first of all, we can get rid of that. So anyway, yes, there is. It's actually kind of funny that reading this now, it certainly was not part of my intent, and I had in fact largely forgotten, because I haven't read Once and Future King for about 10, 15 years. I had largely forgotten about this particular part with Morgan Le Fay. I sort of vaguely remembered Morgan Le Fay, who was transmogrified into Mad Madam Mim in the Sword in the Stone Disney animation, but I had quite forgotten about Robin Hood, and it's particularly funny right now that I should be reading this because the Splintered Sun, the Ostenard book I'm working on at the moment, is about a gang of forest outlaws called Flan's Crows, and I wonder if I was subconsciously remembering that, and that's one of the things that prompted me to reading this. Or it could just be that every single thing I've ever written is, essentially stolen from somewhere else. And that's always possible too. Anyway, so with that, I am going to wrap it up for the evening or the morning or wherever it may happen to be for you. And we will finish off the adventure of Morgan Le Fay's House of Cheesy Goodness tomorrow night, or later tonight, rather. I always get confused by that. Until then, my wild darlings, my tiny army, I just wanted to say, again, thank you very much for joining me. Take good care of yourselves and your loved ones and family, and assuming it's probably the same people for many of us. But all the folks you care about, and even some people you may not know very well, but who might need your help. Even, as I always say, even just a smile sometimes can make a difference for somebody who's having a tough time. And as you are doing that, think carefully about the fact that I will be reading again at 7 p.m. this evening. And if you want to hear the rest and what happens with the griffin and all of that stuff, please join me then, or you can check it out on YouTube, where Chris Fab has so kindly and so steadily put these readings up for people to share. So with that, I say peace and have a good weekend, whatever you have before we get together again. And I will see you very soon. Ciao bambini, ciao ragazzi, and I'll talk to you soon.